One of the greatest privileges and pleasures of my life has been to be a student, law partner, and lifelong friend of Jerry Cohen. And we were just reminiscing, it's been 54 years. Like so many others, who I am today is based upon his wisdom, his guidance, and his friendship. This memoir is a story of an extraordinary life, a life that could have taken many paths, but chose the path of understanding and teaching about China and Chinese law. Jerry has influenced, as this book tells the story, presidents, business leaders, academics, and thousands of others. He has freed dissidents in Korea, in Taiwan, in the Philippines, in China, and of course, his classmate Jack Downey. He's helped shape American policy towards China, and he's helped shape Chinese law. Jerry, I couldn't have possibly known that when I walked into your office in the Pound building at the introduction of Jim Thompson, my then professor and squash partner, 55 years ago, that I was beginning a lifelong friendship that would profoundly influence my life as it would the life of thousands of others. On behalf of all of us, thank you, thank you, thank you. Starting around 15, 20 years ago, I think, Jerry, I began to urge you, even though you tried that, as you tell in the book, very early in life, I begin to urge you to write your memoirs. The experiences that Jerry has had tell the story of an extraordinary life alongside the developments in China over the last 65 years. The book is a must-read, and I should add, it is a wonderful read. The pleasure that I had, and I had to read it on my computer, we didn't have hard copies then, was truly a pleasure. The book describes a lot besides China, but since this is the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, I'm going to focus my questions on China. Of course, having said that, let me ask the first question, which really is not about China. You have there are a lot of lawyers in this room. You have the platinum resume in law. You know, you want lawyers, Pat Norton is here, all these, we know, we all want to be editors-in-chief of the Law Review. We all want to be Supreme Court clerks. We all want to go in and work at the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. So this is the platinum resume among lawyers. Jerry did all of those things. Not only did he clerk, as the book tells, for Chief Justice Earl Warren, but he clerked for Felix Frankfurter. And then he goes to the U.S. Attorney, goes to Covington and Burling, but then he goes off to Berkeley, and he makes a decision to become really the first American law professor to start studying Chinese law. So my first question, Jerry, is this platinum resume, and then becoming an outlier and studying Chinese law when there basically wasn't much Chinese law in 1960. What made you make that decision, and do you regret it?
I certainly can't say now I regret it. There were many decisions that had to be made. I could have regretted some of those also. But I guess I wanted to be an individual. I wanted to be a pioneer. I wanted to do something that not 20 other law professors were doing even better at constitutional law. I wanted to do my own thing. And I don't know why, but I chose law because I thought being an independent lawyer was the best prospect of being an independent person. And my father had been a small town lawyer, and he just practiced on his own, and he had a hard time at times. But I thought I could do it somehow. So it's a desire to be an individual. You brought that out just now. I learned a few things in doing this book. One, I learned that I do have a religion. We have a wonderful son here, there he is, who is a religious doctor. And we have never given him religious support sufficient to his needs. And we always think of me as not someone who has a religion. But I learned through this book I have a faith. And it's not normally in the category of religion, but maybe a belief in social justice. I learned a few other things. It was a surprise to me in assembling the photos for this book how much they focused on getting people out of jail. I didn't set out to say I'm going to try to liberate the political liberal criminals of Asia, but I found one after another. I just seemed to run into these cases, and then I began to see a certain theme there and a certain satisfaction. And that really is, I thought of giving the book a different title, one that was exclusively about China, Up Against the Great Wall. And then people like that, it's good fun, but it didn't suit the content because the book is only 1/3 about China. And the rest are just things you run into in doing a legal career in Asia. I learned a few things. Still much to learn.
When I was your student, we used as kind of the textbook on your course on criminal law, the criminal process in the People's Republic of China from 1949 to 1963. And that was the book that we used as students of Jerry. He always used to ask who was going to play him in the movie. We never quite came up with an answer. But what's so interesting about that today is Jerry interviewed refugees from China during that period in Hong Kong. Today, China is becoming less open, less transparent, more difficult for us to, as you used to always say, visit the judicial organs. Are there lessons from those interviews in the 60s of Chinese refugees for us today?
Are they still valid?
Are the lessons of the interviews that you kind of had of these Chinese refugees into Hong Kong, is that something we're going to need to replicate today because of the greater difficulty in going to China and in visiting the judicial organs?
There certainly are analogies today to a much earlier period. This reminds me of the spring of 1979 when I was in Hong Kong and then visited Taiwan, and the nervousness in Taiwan, the people who wanted to get out, get safe, go somewhere else, the uncertainty is beginning to be what we're seeing now. Although Taiwan's great accomplishments have made so many people more confident that they could stay a little longer. Don't give up so quickly. There are certainly analogies. Refugees, I think we have so many people of Chinese descent in this room that when they read, if they read the criminal process book, they'll recognize so many just distinctively Chinese features. People are people, whether it's 1979 or 2025. And I don't think national characteristics change that rapidly. So I like to think that there's still some value in that book in terms of just there's so much human nature, so much experience that I think it's useful even today in very different circumstances.
The people in Taiwan in late 78, so prior to December 15th, were nervous. They were nervous about what the establishment of diplomatic relations between the US and China was going to mean for Taiwan. In retrospect, it meant for the everyday lives of people not much. That life continued, Taiwan prospered, the democracy prospered, it flourished, people's lives were much better. Is there increasing fear today in Taiwan about their future? Does, I guess, President Trump's decision with respect to Ukraine affect the way people in Taiwan are thinking? This is way beyond the book, but having Jerry is a privilege.
Of course, I haven't been there lately, but I am in touch with people in Taiwan. My impression is that they are understandably confused. They don't know what to expect. And a lot of them are more confident, even though they might not say so, about the future. They're not as worried about their future as we think they should be. And whether they're right or wrong, I don't know. I admire so many people who are sticking it out, staying there, taking a chance. I try to help people who don't feel so confident, but there aren't that many at this point.
Part of the book talks about your involvement in the anti-war movement in the United States in the 60s. So how you believe the US government kind of got it wrong with respect to Vietnam and our policies, and some were your friends, and you worked both in opposition to the war and in favor of establishing diplomatic relations with China. Do you think that may be the case today with respect to China? That the US government has got it wrong?
Well, I do think the US government is being carried along by this popular anti-China attitude that seems to be sweeping the country. Hostility toward China seems to be one of the few themes on which Republicans and Democrats are increasingly united. And I think it's terribly unfortunate. And I think the PRC should be doing much more to try to improve the situation, but we can't rely on China to do it alone. That's why I am here for the National Committee today. The kind of work this organization is doing has to be multiplied many times now, rather than let this tide of anti-PRC attitudes continue to blight our policy. So I do think we're wrong. It's not that only we are wrong, and I hope that both sides, or all sides, can do much more than they've been doing. It's not clear that there's a realization for a need of this. It's not clear the American people realize that they're getting a one-sided view of things. And it's certainly not clear that the Chinese are aware of how unfriendly a lot of their actions are. There seems to be an increasing opinion on both sides of the ocean that Xi Jinping is a very difficult character. I have been recommending to people for a long time that they all see a movie called The Death of Stalin. It's supposed to be a comedy, but the joke is on the people who are governed under that system. And I think unless we have a shift in leadership in China and a shift in leadership in America, which may be somewhat easier to bring about, we're in for a dangerous period.
The book describes your setting up of the offices of the late, great Couder brothers in 1979, and subsequent to that in Beijing, and the subsequent to that, the offices of Paul Weiss. December 31 of last year, Paul Weiss closed its office in Beijing, along with many other firms. What does that tell you, and how does that make you feel, given you were the pioneer who set that up?
Well, it tells you law firms look at the books. And are they losing money? If they are, they're not going to stick with what they're doing. And it's no longer likely that foreign law firms will make as much money as they used to in China. And that's natural, and it's good. Chinese have developed some very able lawyers. And of course, they have the benefit of guanxi, of the system knowing how to take part. So I personally didn't feel anything when I heard Paul Weiss was closing its office. What the newspaper columns didn't tell you was in that very same period, a month or two in the last few months, they were taking on very important lawyers with big practices, not in China, but elsewhere in the world. They were taking on people who really behave like investment bankers, people who are connected to the enormous changes going on in the world at the moment. And the expense the firm has taken on is much greater than one might have thought. So it didn't give a complete picture. But I frankly, I have no connection to Paul Weiss, as you know. The people I brought into the firm as partners, Yvonne Shader and others, they're all gone from Paul Weiss now. They're doing other very useful things, teaching, practice, etc. And I have no more connection to the firm than I did to Goodyear Brothers. So one nice thing about being in teaching or business, if you're independent of previous pressures, you're free to make your own observations. So I don't know anybody at Paul Weiss who really does China at this point. So I didn't feel anything. Maybe I'm becoming immune to the change.
It's funny because I'm long divorced from Paul Weiss, but watching these various firms close made me sad.
Well, it's your business.
There was an element, that having the law firms there, was a glue that held China and the United States together. And that, Western lawyers play the role of explaining to Chinese companies and the Chinese government, the world of international contracts, enforceability. It represented partly the Western investors in China. And when I saw them close, I went, gosh, it's sad. Is this kind of heralding a new era in China's relationship with the world? And if it is, it's not a positive. So it made me sad.
Well, I think you should put more faith in the many Chinese who have absorbed the legal system of the West and managed to interpret it and apply it. Some are in this room. I remember I met Shaolin 30 years ago. There are many who are doing an unheralded job. So I put my faith in the future rather than pining for the past.
Yeah. That's a great way to look at it. Don't pine for the past. I think about those deals we worked on in the 70s and the early 80s. It was the first Western investment in China. And what I learned, forget the law, but what I learned is the people, the Chinese with whom we invested, became much more internationalists and pro-American than the other people, the people around them. So if there were 1,000 people in the joint venture and you compared their attitudes towards America to the 10,000 other people around them, they would be more pro-American and pro-international and pro kind of China being what Bob Zellick would say, the responsible stakeholder. And then when I saw the Chinese come to the United States, I saw the same thing. When you talk to the people in Dayton, Ohio, about Chinese investment, they're positive about it because the Chinese investment has brought jobs. So when I think about those times, I pine for them and I say, geez, I really wish that we could have those times back. But I guess you're more realistic at 94 than I am. But talk a little bit, the book's description about your role in when Henry Liu was assassinated, and your role in the civil suit and in the criminal case of Henry. Talk about that, and then talk about it in terms of Did you think back then that Taiwan could democratize? That Taiwan would become the flourishing democracy that it is today?
Well, there was always the hope, fostered by the Taiwan government of Chiang Kai-shek himself, that Taiwan was a democracy and would become more democratic. Of course, it wasn't. And many of us who were taking part in interaction with Taiwan, we understood that it was a long way from the Chiang Kai-shek regime to anything resembling an authentic democracy. And many of us who said so were treated that way in a hostile fashion. But it happened. And the Henry Liu story, you're talking about his assassination.
Yes.
In San Francisco. I still don't know enough about the background. Many of you in this room may know much more about what was Henry Liu really up to. Was he really a double agent? For whom was he really working? Why did they choose to rub him out? I'm still not clear about the background, but it was clear how they killed him. And some people think he had refused to stop writing a book that would have emphasized the scandals in the Chiang Kai-shek family and regime. Some people think he refused to stop because they didn't offer him enough money. I don't know. I didn't know the man. All I know is what happened when they decided to eliminate him. And I know a little bit about how that was arranged. I felt that it was important to try to work things out despite the absence of an extradition treaty or even diplomatic relations at that point between the U.S. and the Kuomintang, that we try to reach some kind of justifiable result. And I thought, since we knew who the immediate killers were, that we should continue with that action. Moreover, the widow of Henry Liu, she needed money. She was in a difficult position. And I thought solving part of the problem in the courts of Taiwan would lead to a settlement in the United States where the Kuomintang government would honor its obligation to the widow, taking away her, really, a way of life. And the problem was how to accomplish that. You had two legal systems to work with. One, the San Francisco federal court, and the other, the court in Taipei. That was very difficult and I think important event where the Kuomintang government, even with the support of some of my former students, wasn't able to snuff it out. They had to succumb to the pressure of the United States, the need for continuing American help, even though we no longer had diplomatic relations. And the communication systems behind the scenes must have been fascinating. I was only dealing with the surface. It reminded me of Watergate. I never thought before I'd have the opportunity to cross-examine those people who had taken part in the assassination. But there I was in court, and they were giving me answers like it was Watergate. They didn't remember, etc. But the system finally did have to reach some kind of formal, correct conclusion, although it led to the release of some of the worst offenders after a while. That case is worthy of further work because it was a turning point in Taiwan's relation to law and to the world. I was lucky enough to be thrust into the middle of it, not knowing as much as I should have known. What got me there was I needed help. I needed somebody to go into court and represent the widow, Miss Tsai. I was not a Taiwan admitted lawyer, but I had plenty of ex-students who were. And the difficulty of getting any of them to volunteer to help me was a surprise to me. And the courage of those who did, and the result for them, which turned out to be pretty good, was a welcome surprise. I think that case was highly educational. Every day there were TV broadcasts, not only in Taiwan, but in Guangdong province. After each session, it awakened people to how complex the interactions between the Kuomintang and the United States and the authorities in both countries were. That's worthy of further work.
Yeah. Any analogy to China today? In other words, if you say, I expect, 15 years ago, you could say, I expect intra-party democracy, and people would say, maybe. Now they say, you're crazy. It's not going to happen not going to happen in my lifetime.
What's not going to happen?
Any form of democracy in mainland China.
Oh, in mainland
So the question, so in Taiwan, when I was a student there, when you were doing, they would, when I got Time magazine, they would cut out pictures of China and delete them, so I couldn't read in Time magazine about mainland China. And the idea, and obviously they had, they imprisoned Annette Lu, you write about that in the book and how, ultimately you got her out. But the idea at that point in time that Taiwan would democratize was viewed as foolish. So jump ahead 50 years. The idea that China will democratize, that intra-party democracy, so 100 million people get a vote, is viewed as foolish. Do you agree it's foolish? Or in the next 20, 30 years, we'll see that?
I think there's going to be a reaction against Xi Jinping and the current repression. I think that could take many forms. Competition among military armed groups, or competition among people who really want to make the system work. There's a role for lawyers. There are still enough lawyers around China who could be very, very helpful, and some, of course, can go back and play a role. It wouldn't be the first time in Chinese history in the last century, certainly, that Chinese lawyers, having spent time abroad, then return home and try to make an improved system. I don't discard the possibility that some forms of democracy could certainly take place once Xi Jinping departs from the scene. But it could go the other way. We don't know.
Zhang Jingguo had not departed from the scene when he engineered. Zhang Jingguo had not departed from the scene when he engineered this move to democracy.
Yeah, it's very hard to say.
Back to the book, and so I had the pleasure of reading the book in the what I call the unabridged version, which is probably twice the length of this wonderfully edited book, edited by our friend Richard Bernstein.
Right.
So he shortened it significantly. Is there anything, well, two questions. Is there anything in the unabridged version that you really would wish was in this version? That's one question. And the other is, are you going to publish the unabridged version? So those of us, I think the folks in this room are real diehards, and they want to read the unabridged version.
That makes it sound much sexier than it is. First of all, read the appendix. From page 317 to page 339, about 20 pages. I have an attempt to list the students who made the biggest impression on me during my period at Harvard. Some of whom are in this room. And if I forgot you, please forgive me. I start with the apology. Can't remember everybody, although I tried to remember those I felt had some significance. That's what was the principal amount cut out, 20 solid pages. And it was rather, I won't say boring, but taxing to remember all the students from the very first Victor Lee to the very last. And we're still in touch today. If you look at my email this morning, you'll see several from members of that group. We're in continuing contact, and I get help from them in various ways. So the rest of the shortening related to my growing up, my family education, we took a little out of that. We took more out of my experience at Yale College and law school. Those of you who've been through that experience might find it interesting. But there isn't, it's not like hot stuff has been taken out of the book.
Well, there are two. One, I would like to see it in its entirety. So, do you plan on publishing it? And what happened to all the pictures? There's so few. There's so many great pictures. Joan, over the course of my life, probably 50% of the pictures of me were taken by Joan Cohen. And I kept them, and then I submitted them to Jerry for publication. I have to say, not a one is in this copy. So I don't know what happened to all those pictures. There's one on the cover of your last book of you, me, Shelley Gold, and Bob Haldeman getting on the train to Tianjin in 1979. So that one was published, but there's this whole group I sent, and I don't know where they are.
You're getting into the complex relations between a publisher and a writer. Columbia Press, I feel, and I don't like to say it, has been a big disappointment, and in many ways. And one way is they only allowed me 10 photos It's ridiculous. And then you start thinking, how many photos do you see in other books? You don't see that many. And that was very, very uncomfortable trying to pick out whose photos do you put in the book. And that's where I got the theme of I should put in the people who were liberated from some form of arbitrary detention. That was more important than others. But I'd like to do it in a more expansive way. But to tell you the truth, I started this memoir, as I say, for my children, for my grandchildren. My wife and I now have 6 great grandchildren, and we have 5 unmarried grandchildren who are going to produce more. I don't know if we'll be around or not. When I was growing up, especially in high school years, my grandfather, who came over in 1882 from Poland, he used to come and sit with me if I got the flu or something. And what fascinates me now is I never, ever asked him, what was the old country like? Why did he come over? What were his parents like? Did he ever see them again after arriving in America at age 12 with his 14-year-old brother? I talked about problems of today. I was interested in the present and the future, and I had a great opportunity to learn about the past, and I didn't seize it. And it's very hard. My son Seth and other relatives try to eke out what's available, what was it like, but it's not easy. And I thought my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, they should know as much as I can tell them, even if it isn't anywhere near adequate. Now, the interesting thing is, I thought, okay, I told the publisher I wanted to keep that stuff in. The publisher said, after some bargaining, 2 years after publication of this book, I could publish the whole thing. But the fact is, my kids aren't interested. My family's, they've read what I've put out pretty much, or they haven't, and they won't. So in a way, I was kidding myself, thinking that my subsequent generation, the younger people, will want to see the full edition. They couldn't care less.
But you've got Seth and Ethan here, so I bet you they would say they want to see the unabridged version, right?
Yes.
Yes, of course.
They've seen it.
Last question, then we'll kind of go to the audience for a couple of questions. Obviously, studying China is no longer in favor. That a lot of folks, the number of people studying Chinese, the number of people studying Chinese history, Chinese sociology, it's becoming more difficult. So the numbers are sadly dropping. The number of American students going to China is roughly 1/15 of what it was 15 years ago. So what do you tell to students who come in and see you and say, Professor Cohen, should I study China? Should I go to China? Should I choose a career where I'm a clerk at the Supreme Court and take the more traditional path?
I think we need to continue to study China much more than we have. I think we need much more interaction. But making a choice to do that doesn't mean you're giving up your life and becoming a monk, or you're isolating yourself from the rest of life. You've got to train so that you could cope with the kind of world we're confronting. And that involves ability to deal with China, but it involves the ability to deal with lots of other things too. I wouldn't discourage anyone from studying China because it might limit their career now. And you should do what you want. We could all have multiple careers. I think it's best to follow what you're really interested in and what you feel you can make a contribution to. And so I'm an enthusiast. I continue to encourage people to get back in the game, not drop out if they're interested. But there's so many other good things to do, many of which are related to China in some way, that it's not like you're isolating yourself from a good career. So I'd say I'm all for encouraging people to counter this wave you talk about with there are only 350 Americans studying in China today, something like that. I'm an enthusiast even now.
Fortunately, they're slightly more than 350, but it's only 1,000. Jerry, thank you so much for what you've done for everybody. Thank you so much for writing this wonderful book.
Well,
it's really...
Thank you for plugging it. And by the I should...
Sorry, you had one more word?
I should say the missing link here is my wife. She's not well, and she'll never write her memoirs. But there is a film being made about her, a feature 90-minute documentary, and that will come out later this year, and I hope you'll get to see it.